Indeed. Okay, so we'll start with Kathy Fan. So Kathy Fan is a senior software engineer at Google, a literature and language learning enthusiast, and an amateur translator taking part in a Chinese English poetry project. She received her BSE in computer science and certificate in French language and culture from Princeton University, and she hopes to pursue graduate studies in comparative literature and translation theory in the future. Her research interests include Chinese, French, and English translation, 19th century French literature, prosody, and digital humanities. So she's going to present a paper to us today entitled From Shandong to Seattle, Translating Contemporary Chinese Poems for an Anglophone Audience. Over to you, Kathy. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tiffany, for the introduction. And let me just pull up my presentation. All right. Yeah, please feel free to interrupt me if something stops with the presentation, but hopefully it's visible now.
Yeah, it's again, see it. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, so I'm going to jump right in with some brief context about the translation project I've been working on, as well as a short introduction to Ezra Pound's Cathay Chinese English poetry collection. And so then the subsequent discussions on the mechanics of co-translation and the tensions in Chinese English translation will primarily draw from my project while referencing similarities and insights from Pound's collection. And finally, I will end with a short sketch of how copyright worked out for our translation projects. So the poet whose works we translate is known by pen name Ah Hua. She is a contemporary writer from Shandong province, China, and she's a member of the China Writers Association, with works appearing in numerous literary journals in China, as well as dedicated collections such as Xiangpu Ji, which contains 166 poems across 6 volumes. And Aha's life is actually quite interesting. She has like a whole other day job in finance, and I put a link here to an interview where you can learn more about her. In terms of translating her works to English, we focused on the 30 or so poems in Book 1 of Xiangpu Ji. And in addition, she has given us 25 unpublished works that she wrote more recently, and we have been working through translations of those as well. The translation team consists primarily of myself and my poetry partner, who goes by the pen name Xuelan. In terms of Chinese familiarity, I'm a native speaker and have taken undergraduate level classical Chinese as well. Xuelan is not of Asian descent, but she has been learning Chinese for many years. And I said primarily because while Xuelan and I are the ones who drive the translations through corresponding with the poet and the publisher in China and organizations potentially interested in publishing our translations. I'd also like to give a shout out to SJ, who's a retired Chinese senior based in Seattle as well. She doesn't help with the English side of the translations, but she and Xuelan frequently chat about interpreting the Chinese in Ahua's poems. So now that we have an overall picture of the translation project, I'll switch over to introducing Ezra Pound's Cathay. This is a collection of 18 poems translated from Chinese to English and published in 1915. Most of the poems are attributed to 8th century poet Li Bai, who was known in Japan under the name Rihaku. So why is that relevant? Let's read the entire subtitle shown here on the cover. So it says, translations by Ezra Pound, for the most part from the Chinese of Rihaku, from the notes of the late Ernest Fenollosa, and the decipherings of the professors Mori and Arriga. So what does that all mean? It's a very long subtitle. Well, the process by which Cathay came about is actually a great segue into co-translation. Ernest Fenollosa was an American who spent many years in Japan teaching at the Imperial University, and around 1899, he wanted to study classical Chinese poetry. His teacher for this task was Mori Kainan, who was a specialist in the field. However, since Fenollosa barely knew Japanese nor Chinese, they needed a translator for this process, and that was Arriga Nagao, Fenollosa's student who had been educated in the West. The three of them would have learning sessions together where Kainan explained the classical Chinese poems line by line. Nagao translated these interpretations to Fenollosa, and Fenollosa took notes as they went along. After Fenollosa's death, Ezra Pound eventually acquired these notes from Fenollosa's widow, and with these notes managed to put together Cathay, despite having little knowledge of translation of Chinese himself. So we can view this as a very particular way of co-translating, even asynchronously through time. There are, in fact, many possible approaches to co-translation. So in an earlier session of the draft seminar hosted by the Australian Society for French Studies, Dr. Sophie Patrick from the University of New England shared that in the project she headed, there involved a group of student translators, and then the students split into subgroups to work on separate chapters of a large work that they were translating. And then the group leaders would edit the chapters for consistency across the entire project. So that's the divide and conquer approach I listed here. And when working with a partner, you can imagine that both of you can come up with your own translations and then combine them into a single version. But in my case, Shola and I took an iterative approach, meaning that she wrote the initial translations, I made edits, and then left comments for things I thought we should discuss. We would meet on video chat about once a week to clean up the translations and repeat as necessary. And I may be slightly biased because my full-time job is software engineering at Google, but Google Docs has been a key tool for this process. So when I directly make edits to the draft, I tend to use the suggestions mode, and this makes all the edits highlighted and really easy to review. Meanwhile, the doc comments are also handy for remembering discussion topics later. The value of performing translation as a collaborative practice, in my opinion, lies in its inclusiveness and productivity. It is inclusive because teamwork enables translators with very different levels of source and target language proficiencies to participate. So as we saw with Ezra Pound's Cathay, quite remarkably, he was able to put together these translations, relying heavily on Fenollosa's notes, even though neither of them really knew Chinese. And with my project as a second example, I'm a native Chinese speaker, but my partner is not. And translating Chinese as a non-native speaker can be a particularly daunting task because, as Wang observes in this quote here from a paper, many Chinese words can work as either nouns or adjectives or verbs, depending on the context. So the reader needs to decide the parts of speech for different words and to ascertain the necessary grammatical connection from the context of arguments of the poem. So I'm very happy that through our partnership, Shulan has the confidence to take a stab at translations, knowing that I will be there to fix any obvious misinterpretations. In an academic setting, students learning foreign languages might find it really daunting, if not seemingly impossible, to put their translations out there into the world. Co-translation, where professors or graduate students mentor and collaborate with underclassmen, could be one way to helping foreign language learners build skills, confidence, and maybe even some publication credentials to further their academic careers. And next, co-translation is productive because individual translators can achieve their own personal goals coming into the project, while at the same time achieving collective goals of the group. So with this project, my partner Sherlan's goal was mostly improving her mastery of the Chinese language, while mine was doing some hands-on translation. So through the collaboration, I'm able to help her learn more Chinese, while she helps me with iterating on the translations and producing them much quicker than if I were doing it on my own. In this way, we achieve our individual goals while collectively working towards the goal of broadcasting Ahua's poetry to a more international audience. And lastly, we are very fortunate to be working with a writer who is still alive and who we can reach relatively easily. Ahua herself sometimes participates in our translation process by means of clarifying specific word choices that she made and sharing tidbits of her life story with us. So now let's walk through some specific poems that we worked on and talk about some of those decisions we made in the process. The first challenge we encountered comes from prosody, or the patterns of rhythm and sound. So Chinese is a language with impressive brevity. A single monosyllabic character can capture the meaning of an entire phrase in English. For example, in his notes that Fenollosa wrote, he observes that verbs are so minutely qualified that to sail a boat for purposes of pleasure would be an entirely different verb from to sail for purposes of commerce. He describes the Chinese language to be of a forceful, concrete, terse, and fine nature, and this is especially true in the poetic form. Thus, when translating, there is a delicate balance between the desire to preserve this rhythmic brevity and the need for interpretability. So in this first poem by Hua, the title Hua Hao Yue Yuan appears as the last phrase of the poem as well. And Hua Hao Yue Yuan can be transliterated as flowers, beautiful, moon round. However, this direct correspondence is quite awkward to read, and we might ask ourselves whether the awkward noun-adjective order actually adds to the translation, or whether it's falling into the trap of creating some sense of linguistic otherness without much semantic significance. Scholars writing about Pound's Cafe have cautioned against such transliterations, pointing out precisely that at times they seem more like decorative details void of specific cultural reference, lending an air of foreignness and included for their exotic look and sonic effect. So how about we adopt a more conventional adjective-noun order, where we say beautiful flowers, round moon? Or we could use ideal happiness or perfect bliss to translate the literal imagery as its abstract connotation. In this case, we eventually yielded to a longer prose-like phrase that, despite the length, preserved the parallel structure of the original. And this was blooming like flowers, full like the moon. The recurrence of the oo sound further strengthens this correspondence. Expanded into prose, our title flows smoothly when reused at the end of the poem, and it remains imagery dominant instead of interpreting the meaning on the reader's behalf. In contrast, these lines in the middle, we translate 沉静,寂寞 succinctly as silent, alone. So here, the singularity of the words further the sentiment of the narrator on their solo journey. A third example is in the lines 石头奔跑,秀旋开花. The four character tuples of the original lend it a natural rhythm. Our phrases in English, however, are they're likewise short, but however do not have the identical syllabic meter that would replicate this beat. So instead, we employed other sound devices to provide a sense of unity, namely the repetition in the alliterating R and S sounds. Rocks tumble, ribbons of rust bloom, a raspy horn sings songs of the grasslands. This was especially appropriate since the hissing S sound helps convey the picture of the melancholic horn blowing across the windy plains. In summary, in this poem, our varied literary approaches when confronted with the same challenge of translating compact Chinese phrases demonstrates the creativity it takes to translate a poem and give it a new life in a new language. The next major challenge we faced was with conveying authenticity when cultural allusions can be perceived as otherness by readers from a different background. This next poem by Hua, Questions, is a stream of consciousness poem that depicts living without answers, moving from the timeless to the moment when, fearing her insignificance, the speaker asks, whose throat sounds a triumphant horn for me? As translators, we faced a different kind of inexpressibility when confronted with cultural allusions in the text. So the poem opens with a historical figure, Qu Yuan, asking who fathomed 九重之天, or literally the 9 realms of heaven, a term steeped in Chinese cosmology. The number 9 symbolizes vastness, since 9 is the largest single-digit number. In other words, even in Chinese, the 9 realms does not have a direct meaning. So instead of conveying this false literal and still having to explain it with a footnote, we simply use the heavens in our translation. It turns out that we suffer little loss in translation, for conveniently, the next phrase alludes to the vastness of the skies as well. So here, in translating the words 巨大, which literally mean giant, we use the word Herculean and performed the opposite of what we did before. So we injected a Roman reference where there wasn't one. Despite having no connection to Chinese culture, it lends the poem a mythical layer befitting the creation of the world that's being discussed. Later, brutality is modified by 绵里藏针. So here, the left-hand radical in 绵 hints that it stands for 丝绵 or silk batting, instead of the more common 棉 for cotton. So the silk radical here is significant of a choice from the poet. The juxtaposition of a cold, sharp needle with the most soft and luxurious of duvets depicts the speaker's sense of utmost betrayal. However, the word batting lacks elegance in translation, and with silk batting in particular, something rare in Western households, the phrase could be confusing. So we simply say, needle hidden in silk. After translating it this way, we were aware that it could paint a slightly different picture in the reader's minds, namely of a needle poking into silk fabric rather than batting. But we decided that the delicate material itself was enough to evince the pain of finding an unpleasant discovery in an unexpected place. Illusions like these not only manifested in our choice within the body of a poem, but also influenced the set of translations we would pick for journal submissions, especially when there would be a limited word count on how much we could explain about the poem in an accompanying commentary. For example, in one instance, we picked a set of poems that fit into a more universal theme, like the changing seasons, rather than an alternative set of poems that had a more Buddhist undertone and stronger cultural allusions. And finally, as you may have noticed in both poems above, we did make use of footnotes. This was something that we discussed a lot about as well between Xuelan and I. On one hand, we don't want to shove too much meaning into the footnotes. It seems almost lazy in a way because you're kind of changing the format of the text to give yourself much more space to explain. And especially with poetry where readers are meant to think and interpret for themselves, this can seem inauthentic to the form. On the other hand, going back to the first type of difficulty we face with prosody and brevity, trying to say too much in the text can also make the translation too wordy and stray from the form of the original. I actually asked Dr. Patrick during her draft seminar talk, which I mentioned earlier, about how they treated footnotes. And I think ultimately it just comes down to stylistic preferences. And perhaps the importance is more so to have a consistent approach to when to use footnotes or not. And I would love to hear if any of you have received or given specific guidance on footnotes at the end of the session. So to wrap up, I like to end my presentation with sharing how copyright worked out for our projects. Given that legal and commercial constraints vary by country or situation, don't take this as an example to follow per se. However, I just hope that the insight helps demystify what the process could look like. So with Ahua's unpublished works, we were able to directly communicate with her, and she was very kind to give us permission to print the original Chinese text, permission to perform translation, and permission to print our English translation, provided that the journal we submit to does not demand exclusive copyright over the text going forward. With the published works in Chinese copyright law, which is similar to US and Australian laws in this regard, the copyright owner also holds the rights to make adaptations of the work, such as translation. This means that Shandong Publishing House holds the translation rights by default. However, we were able to get in touch with them, and at first they were hesitant about allowing translations of the work. They were assuming commercial intents and asking us about what's the volume of publication, when are we going to publish them, and etc. Since the original publication was in the form of an anthology of poems, I think that's what they expected of our translation as well. They were just not as familiar with the concept of submitting like 2 to 5 poems to a journal or to an indie publishing house. But in the end, we were able to explain this to them and agree on permissions to perform translation and to publish the translations, though Shandong Publishing still holds the copyright over the originals. So for these published poems, we cannot submit the English and Chinese side by side. So this was another factor that affected which poems we submitted to journals, based on the journal's requirements and whether we felt that the poem was best represented as a standalone English text or in the context of its original. And overall, I think the takeaways here are clarifying intent is key in communicating with publishers who are very protective over their rights, as they should be, because they put all the work into producing those physical copies, and to expect varying degrees of familiarity with different forms of publishing, which may be less or more common in different countries or fields. So this concludes my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to questions and discussions after the next talk.
Thank you very much, Kathy. For those of you who actually nobody knows, Kathy is in Japan at the moment, and it's very late. It's 1:30 in the morning. It's a very impressive level of clarity for somebody speaking at such an hour. So thank you very much for a very clear and stimulating presentation. You should be able to, stop sharing your screen and we'll move on to Margherita, if you want to share your screen. Margherita,
Sure.
if you're able to. And while you're doing that, I'll introduce you. So if I find there it is. So Margherita ZANOLETTI is a graduate of the Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan and has a PhD in translation studies from the University of Sydney. From 2006 to 2009, she taught Italian language and translation at the University of Sydney and Macquarie University, and currently serves as reference service specialist at Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore, where she guest lectures on modern language courses. Her publications include Oodgeroo Noonuccal, My People, La Mia Gente, published in 2021, Bruno Munari, The Lightness of Art, published in 2017, and Oodgeroo Noonuccal with We Are Going, in 2013. And you'll be able to correct my faulty pronunciation of the author of the piece that you're going to be talking to us about today, Stradbroke Dreamtime, published in 1972. Over to you, Margherita.
Thank you so much for this kind presentation, and thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts, some reflections about Oodgeroo's work. I just start, and I also want to say I'm very happy to be in dialogue with Kathy Fan's presentation, because I think there were already many points, many interesting points of discussion that might be potential discussion elements. All right, so I would begin perhaps introducing the protagonist of my presentation, the author, for those of you who might be not familiar with her work. Oodgeroo of the Noonuccal tribe, 1920-1994. He's famous because she's the first published Aboriginal poet in Australia ever. So with her first collection of poetry in 1964, she became also the first Aboriginal woman to publish a book in her country. She was also an activist, a political campaigner for Indigenous rights, and an educator, a children educator, but also an educator for adult target. She also traveled around the world to represent the interests of her own people. So Stradbroke Dreamtime is a work, a narrative work. It's not a poetry work. It was published in 1972. At the time, her name was still Kath Walker. She became Oodgeroo of the Noonuccal tribe in 1988 in protest against the bicentenary celebration of James Cook's arrival on the continent land. It's an autobiographical book. It comprises 27 stories for children. It's written in English, entirely in English, the language of the colonizers. It's divided into two parts. The first part includes episodes from her childhood spent on her birthland, North Stradbroke Island, Minjerribah in Yandai language. And part two includes creation stories and stories based on her own knowledge of her people and the land. Oodgeroo explains at some point that she wrote these stories, the stories included in Stradbroke Dreamtime, while she was staying in Queensland with another author, the Australian poet Judith Wright. And she says, it's a lovely place, the home of thousands of birds and animals, and Judith Wright helps to guard the mountain and its creatures from greedy speculators. So at the time, it's visible that the ecological concerns were really strong in the forefront of her mind in those days. And I'm saying this because we'll see that the environmental theme is a very important theme in her work. But why Stradbroke Dreamtime? Why talking about this book? It's a bestseller in Australia, so to say. It was published in 6 editions and sold thousands of copies. It's one, let's say, classic book. It's a classic book that is read in schools, for example. So it won also an award in 1994, a Children's Book Council Book of the Year award. And it was also, it's nice to mention that it's the first Indigenous Australian literary work translated into a European language. So far, it's been translated in different language. Well, I wanted to concentrate, to focus my attention on this book. Well, my engagement with Oodgeroo's work is a long story. I have been studying her work for almost 20 years. I have published some publications of her, including some translation of her work. And while approaching Oodgeroo's work, I noticed that so far, scholarly contributions focusing on Stradbroke Dreamtime are very, very limited. They can be counted on the fingers of 2 hands, in fact. And this even in spite of the recent surge of interest in Oodgeroo's work. All commentators agree that Stradbroke Dreamtime reflects Oodgeroo's empathy for children. She was an educator, she was a teacher, she was a poet and a writer, but they also say that this book is also reflective of Oodgeroo's strategies for multicultural communication. With Stradbroke Dreamtimes, Oodgeroo plays the role of a negotiator between 2 words. The indigenous words, which is the words she belongs to, she feels she belongs to, and the white word, white Australia. She belongs to white Australia as well. But her aim is to put these 2 words into dialogue. Anyhow, all commentators so far have paid little attention to the translation character of Oodgeroo's work. They all talk about multicultural communication, but they never tried to explore the translation dimension, meaning by translation, not a purely linguistic transcoding, but a process of interpretation aimed at creating new connections, new relationships, new meanings, new knowledge. And this is what I would like to concentrate upon, asking myself and sharing with you my concerns about what the translational dimension of Oodgeroo's work might be, and how, from a methodological point of view, how can a translation perspective based on a broad concept on translation, on a semiotic concept of translation, elicit better insights into creative phenomena such as Oodgeroo's work. And to do so, I would like to focus on three concepts: geomesic translation, interlingual translation, and intercultural translation. I have already engaged with Oodgeroo's translation from concentrating on other types of translation, such as, for example, intersemiotic translation or epistemic translation. But today I would like to see how Oodgeroo, with her work, how she tried to transform oral knowledge into written narrative, how she resemiotized stories and legends from Aboriginal Australian languages and dialects into English language, and how she transmitted her own life experience and culture to people of all descent and extraction. Okay, just very briefly, geomesic translation could be defined as a transformation, as a passage from one linguistic modality to another. For example, from oral to written, or from written to into oral. Translation scholars often cite geomesic translation in relation to the creation, for example, of subtitles and captions for audiovisual material. But in this case, in Stradbroke Dreamtime, my argument is that geomesic translation is activated in the transition from oral verbal science to written verbal science, and in particular from an orally based language culture into a Western language culture, from orality to oraliture or orature, as it has been defined. The second dimension is, of course, interlingual translation. As I said, Stradbroke Dreamtime was written in English. So apparently, Oodgeroo was of indigenous descent, but she appropriated the language of the colonizer to formulate, to express her thoughts and her memories. But the basin from which she took inspiration is the basin of the traditional stories that were transmitted orally from generation to generation until also to her. This is an important operation because between the late 40s and the early 50s, in Australia, traditional Aboriginal literature not written by Aborigines came into vogue due to the efforts of anthropologists, white anthropologists, who wanted to unearth Aboriginal myths and to share these myths with a broader audience. While Oodgeroo based her own translation work on previous recordings, as well as on personal research and memories of stories told mostly at night around campfires. So there are live testimonies, there is a live experience that is the basis of the inspiration of her own work. The map that you see on the right is the map of the languages, today's languages, indigenous languages in Australia. So the invaders, says Oodgeroo, saw the Aboriginal legends as a way of making money, as a way to appropriate these stories and become richer, become more famous, become popular. The third dimension is intercultural translation, which implies a series of extra linguistic factors. In this case, we talk about a movement of science by a member of a cultural community so that this science can be interpreted and understood by a different cultural community. Of course, this shift, this movement is marked by a search for homological adequacies or diatopical hermeneutics. So we needed to find similarities. And it's not always easy. In fact, the difficulties vary with the degree of distance between the languages and the cultures involved. I think we have seen something like this also in the previous presentation. Another aspect that I find, I retrace in Stradbroke Dreamtime is that the relationship with the other in intercultural communication is constitutive of the subject. So we are not talking about two separate entities, but two others that are in a relation and who define themselves in relation to the other. This can be seen also in Stradbroke Dreamtime, where intercultural translation is an adaptational and ultra-semiotic work, which contributes to Oodgeroo's self-definition and transmission of knowledge. Of course, Stradbroke Dreamtime is an illustrated book, so illustrations can also be viewed as part of this process, of this strategy, and are crucial to the full representation of meaning. Okay, but I will proceed as quickly as possible to tell you some basic information about Oodgeroo, just to be able to understand the importance of this book, something about the book, the structure and the theme, and then I'll show you a short excerpt from the book to attempt some textual analysis and looking for some aspects of diamesic, interlingual, and intercultural translation as activated by the author. First of all, something which I need to say, the book was published in 1972, which corresponds to the second phase, what is defined as the second phase of Oodgeroo's life and work, when she withdrew from public life after a phase of strong political activism to a more secluded life, still active, but more detached from the political debate on her own native land, on Stradbroke Island. And here she shifted from poetry production to prose production. On the island, she found a new home and gave life to an education and cultural center open to children, black children, to white children, to people of all backgrounds, where she could promote and share some elements of the indigenous culture. This initiative, the school that she founded, belonged, in fact, to a historical phase when similar educational projects were emerging around the country. I say this very briefly, but it's important just to give a context to Oodgeroo's endeavor. She was not alone in doing that, but she was very successful in her attempt. Well, when she moved to Mungalba, to the island, children education became the center of her life. And the contemporary debate and the social change happening everywhere in Australia at the time was also going in the same direction, towards the same direction. as women, peace activists, and First Nations peoples sought to be heard, to be listened, to be accepted and respected. In fact, Oodgeroo never once described herself as a poet. She would call herself an educationalist. Her job was to educate white and black people. So she interpreted her role of a translator, not just as a writer, but as an educator on all levels, searching for contact zones among cultures and developing new forms of cultural understanding and intercommunication that may they may encourage dialogue. Also, in this phase, she focused on the environment. At some stage in an interview, Oodgeroo said, "I'm out of the civil rights movement. I'm back to nature." So she wanted to devote herself to ecological activism. And this also fitted into the macro context of environmental movements, which in Australia were particularly careful and sensitive about problems relating to the mining industry, which was active also on Stradbroke Island at the time. So it was a real concern. And we will see that the connection with the land, the importance to preserve the environment, is a central theme in Stradbroke Dreamtime, but at the same time, it has always been central in Aboriginal culture. So Aboriginal people were always respectful of the environment and felt themselves as custodians of their land. Another shift is the shift from poetry to prose. We know that Oodgeroo's poetry is a political poetry, is an activist poetry, is a protest poetry. While the stories of Stradbroke Dreamtime were intended primarily for people visiting Minjerribah, the cultural center, and were set on the island. And in these stories, the author seems to concentrate on continuity, connections, interrelatedness of past and present, and cross-cultural links. So rather than denouncing racial prejudice and inequality, she would like to focus on continuity, on preservation. And she would translate through a diamesic, interlingual, and intercultural process a corpus of knowledge handed down orally from generation to generation into literature written in English. So a few things about Stradbroke Dreamtime. Let me say that it's an unusual book because it's a mixture of autobiographical stories and, so to say, traditional stories, indigenous stories. This mixture is more evident, in fact, in the original manuscript than in the published text. The editorial intervention of the publisher changed a lot of the original concept of the book. This has been already discussed. I want to mention this because we talked in the previous presentation of the process, the collective process that sometimes brings to a publication. In this case, it's important to mention that also the editorial intervention on the text was a crucial phase of making the book. The first part of the book includes 13 stories inspired by the author's childhood. Of course, when the book was written, Oodgeroo was an adult, but the viewpoint which is expressed in the book is always that of a child. So stories are amusing, light-hearted, and we can follow the adventures of Kath, her parents, her family. We can see the island, the natural beauties, the rules that regulated Muka society, the indigenous society, back when she was a little girl. But many experiences that she describes are common to Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal children, so we can identify with her. The second part includes stories from the old and the new Dreamtime. Just is a must say that the English term Dreamtime is a translation, is a superimposed translation from for Alcaringa, the original, the indigenous name of Aboriginal people's system of spiritual belief. And this word refers to a mythical time and place where, when, and where ancestral beings created the earth. So this title, Stories from the Old and the New Dreamtime, tries to translate and transmit in English a knowledge, a complex knowledge made of stories transmitted orally and also conveyed traditionally through ceremonies, drawings, music, performances, dances, and traditional stories. So this passage from oral to literature could be associated to the concept of oraliture. Oraliture is the passage from oral material to literary written material, and is characterized by the breaking down of barriers between orality and writing, and it's oriented by dialogue, plurivocity, and hospitality. So I perhaps just mention very briefly that this division of old and new Dreamtimes is an allusion to a poem of Judith Wright's that talks about the conjunction, the connection between white and black Australia, but also evokes biblical themes, the Old and the New Testaments, which of course Oodgeroo revisits and re-narrates with radical differences in her own work. I just mentioned that we don't have a male god, but we have a great mother. We have a rainbow serpent, which is the creator of the earth. And we talk about sin, we talk about death, we talk about rules in a very different way than in the Old Testament. Okay, now we have just a few minutes, but I really wanted to show you at least a few lines of the incipit of the book, as this short story titled Stradbroke is the very opening of the first part of the book. And I have highlighted some words in this text that recount that the colonization of the land is evident since the first lines, where the Anglophone name Stradbroke, which was chosen in 1827 in reverence of the son of the Earl of Stradbroke, couples the English toponym Point Lookout, which was coined in 1770 by James Cook himself, while the original name of Point Lookout was Mulumba, meaning rocky place. So this is the situation. Already in the first lines, we have a colonized place, we have a translated place, even the toponyms are not the original ones. And the island is described as stocked with natural beauty. It's like heaven on earth. But, immediately after the island, the family enters the scene and is qualified as my Aboriginal family. Then there is another reference later on when she tells us that father told us that some of our neighbors to the north of Australia prayed to their god to bless their fishing fleet. And so she refers to the spirituality of the indigenous inhabitants of the island, but also with this lower cap god. It's not God, the Christian God, but without capital initial, we see like a collocational shift that contributes to share with us some of the Aboriginal life words with the readers, telling us it's not the God, the Christian God, it's another God. And then again, then there is an abrupt change. The island is different now. So after the emphasis on the beauty and happiness surrounding Kath and her family, another protagonist enters the scene, the white man. And so we have civilization, perhaps a bit ironic. And there is an anti-futurist climax where we have civilization, motor cars, industry, machines that disfigure Stradbroke, demolish nature, corrupt the harmony of the place. And this here we could retrace many references also to Oodgeroo's poetry, where she employs verses to denounce pollution, to denounce the destruction of the environment, the death of the environment. So the birds and the animals are going. So we can notice that the story opens in suffused tones and ends with accusation, and it starts slowly and it ends with an accelerator, a sudden acceleration with the arrival of the whites. This imbalance can be seen as a metaphor for the experience of the First Nations people, who for millennia were the undisturbed custodians of their lands until they were abruptly plundered. So we don't have, we have here a poetic tone, but at the same time, a militant tone pervading the last paragraphs. So to conclude, just very briefly, it would take a longer presentation probably to analyze better Oodgeroo's writing, but my superficial, at least, presentation wanted to unearth, to highlight two facts. One, that Noonuccal's writing displays a strong translational character. This is a key feature of her work. And also, I would like to suggest that translation is a hermeneutic tool that is applicable to varied medial, cultural, and creative products. And also, when we read Oodgeroo's work through a translation lens, we can notice new complexities, new aspects of her writing. So her style and language is simple only at first sight. With the longer textual analysis, we could notice colloquialisms, Anglophone lexicon, calques, and collocational shifts that connect orality and writing and give shape to a complex form of oraliture. And in the end, the author aims to affirm her own identity by gathering, reformulating, and preserving elements of the Aboriginal knowledge and translating them into new stories for a new public. So her urgency, I believe, is to reach a broader audience, expressing her message under the form of a storytelling written in the language of the colonizers. I'm not sure, but I think this was the last slide. So thank you very much for your attention, and for sharing the discussion.
Thank you very much, Margherita. It seems fitting that you've presented this today, since with the 25th of January here in Europe, from where we're speaking, but it's currently the 26th of January in Australia, and so it's the national holiday, Australia Day, which in the past few years has been commonly known as Invasion Day among many people. So it seems fitting that you're speaking, or that you've spoken about this author today, and that, well, especially in the beginning when you were talking about her decision to change her name, and the name under which she published around the time of the bicentenary celebrations. Lots of echoes there. So thank you very much for your presentation. If anybody has any questions, feel free to use the chat, or otherwise you can raise your hand, or just jump in at any stage. I might start with a question for each of you individually, and then we'll see how we go. So just going back to Kathy's presentation. So this is something that Margherita touched on when she was speaking, this idea of collaboration and translation. Though your collaboration was the collaboration that you were mentioning was more in terms of authors working with editors, I guess. But Kathy was speaking specifically about co-translation, I guess. And I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about that. And the idea is a very interesting idea that you had of working with one native speaker and one non-native speaker. And I was wondering if you noticed any trends in the sorts of things that both of you were changing together in the weekly meetings that you were having, which sound really stimulating, but also quite intense and time consuming. But yeah, if you noticed any trends that I guess both of you already had in your translation practice that were different because of your linguistic and cultural background, perhaps, before you started editing together.
Yeah, I think if I think back, two main kinds of things that I would edit from Xuelan's initial drafts. One main category was kind of like modifiers. So Chinese it could be very specific, where kind of connecting words like to and the and like those little words in between. Sometimes like they can also have take a meaning of like as well, or like, oh, again, right? Like even though it might look like a very similar verb form to saying like come here, but it might mean come here again. So there's like little differences in meaning like that sometimes is quite difficult to pick out, because that extra character that signals the again might have other usages where you can kind of ignore it more. And so it's hard to tell like whether it changes a meaning or it does not. So that was one thing that came up quite commonly. And I think the other was with like the connotations of words that seem a bit more neutral. So for example, I remember in one of the poems, it was describing, there was like an imagery of like burning, burning the crops in the fall, and like describing like the flames, the way they rose. And the word that was used in the Chinese poem, like it connoted more of like smoke rising, almost like evil witches, like kind of like seductively almost with that kind of, yeah, like those connotations. But then from the words itself, it wasn't super apparent unless you kind of knew like how they were commonly used in context. So like initially the translation didn't quite capture that. It was like just like a more generic like negative connotation, but there was kind of like that flavor to it, which was a little bit difficult for me to explain, but I kind of just pointed to a few other contexts where those would have been used. Yeah.
Okay, and so it was mostly in terms of the subtleties of the connotations of the original text and the language used in the original text, obviously, but also in
Yeah,
terms of
there were a lot of like little
grammatical
details that like especially because the lines of the poems were usually so short, you know, like this every word you chose kind of changed the meaning a little bit. So I feel like it was really important to get it right.
And the idea of the length of the lines is something I was going to ask you about, because you talked, you gave a couple of examples where you'd expanded in the translation. I was wondering to what extent rhythm came into play when you were considering different translation choices.
Yeah, I think for the most part, we tried to keep lines shorter, and I believe in all cases we kept the same number of lines, and like similar line breaks when a phrase would carry over multiple lines in a stanza. But yeah, because like in Chinese poetry, a lot of the times they're incomplete sentences that like skip like the subject, for example, or but then sometimes I think in the English it was more important to clarify like whether like maybe we added like a they to the beginning of the phrase, or like I. So in those cases we would add a little bit for clarity, but I think we tried to keep it pretty minimal.
Yeah, that does sound very minimal. So, adding in pronouns seems to be reasonable as addition. Okay, great. Yeah, and you're also talking about the idea of, adding the kind of temptation to add more through footnotes, and that was a question you wanted to ask others as well. So maybe just a reminder, if anybody has any experience with footnotes in translation, in the translation of poetry in particular, I guess. If you want to think about that and jump in a minute, but I'll switch over and ask Margherita a question now. Thanks very much, Kathy. I was wondering if Margherita, you talked a bit about the style of this work, and how it changed from the author's previous style. So you still said that like you said that in the 60s the work was had much more of an activist tone, I guess, than this book, Stradbroke Dreamtime, sorry. But then you still mentioned that there was the idea in the paragraph that you showed us at the end of denouncing, I guess, the colonizer. But I was wondering to what extent, I guess, the style did really shift, and what it was like originally, and why you think this kind of this shift came about.
It's an excellent question, Tiffany. Thanks, because in fact, this fracture, this division between period 1 and period 2 is a functional division to evoke two steps, two different periods of Oodgeroo's career, but instead, in spite of differences between and the undeniable predomination of prose writing rather than poetry writing, I agree with you, and I think that the text that we read before suggests this fact. There are similarities as well. The strength with which Oodgeroo again recounts the transformation of her own land is visible in although Stradbroke Dreamtime is conceived as a children's book. But she wants to be an educator. She doesn't want to tell us good night stories just to say goodbye, good night, and we all sleep well. No, she wants to disturb our lives, to change our. So she remains on the line of a militant style. So thank you for asking.
it just seemed a little more subtle. I guess why I haven't read the text in the 60s, but the opposition that she was establishing between nature and man, she used the term man, man's greed and men's machines. But it seemed to be less, I guess, kind of forceful in terms of an attack on the colonizer. It didn't seem to be obvious, but maybe it is elsewhere in the text. But in any case, it just seemed to me that she was setting up a distinction between man and nature, not necessarily setting up a distinction between the colonizers and the people who were colonized. And I was wondering that, you know, if back in her previous work, that was more of a concern for her, setting up a distinction between the blacks and the whites, which was, you know, also you mentioned that there was this desire to have a dual audience in Stradbroke Dreamtime, Stradbroke, sorry, Dreamtime. So yeah, I was interested in that evolution as well. Yeah.
No, that's also a very good question, and thank you for raising all these topics. Of course, in Stradbroke Dreamtime, the environmental issue is a very key topic,
Mhm.
and but at the same time, I find in this book as well as in her poetry a connection between the environmental theme and the political theme, in the sense that colonization has caused destruction.
Mhm.
So, although the opposition is man and nature, I believe that she's suggesting the white man's ways
Oh.
are not the good ways, are
Mhm.
not the ways to preserve and to protect the land. It's just a way to exploit the land or to uh, not to care about it. So the concept of care and custodianship is very strong, and I think there is a connection between the political theme and the eco theme.
Yeah, sure. And I guess also the fact that she's writing for children, it seems to be a more kind of relatable theme, you know, nature and man, even though the use of the term man is quite suggestive, as you say, of the colonizer. Very interesting. I wanted to ask you a question as well about the idea of oral literature, which you touched on in your conclusion. You said that there were hints of that in the text in terms of calques and borrowings and other things. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a bit more about that, if you're able to, about the kind of the traces, I guess, the linguistic traces and the stylistic traces. Or hints of the author's background, because as you were saying, she decided to write in English, in the language of the colonizer, to expand her audience. But in what way, I guess, did she play with language or twist and you know, I don't know, break down the rules of language, I guess, to infuse it with her own linguistic and cultural background.
That's also an interesting, a very interesting theme. I have to admit, for the sake of justice, that a scholar, something like 20 years ago, her name is Jones, she studied, she compared in a very meticulous ways the original manuscript of the book and the published version. And she found like hundreds of corrections, and
Yeah.
all corrections are corrections of colloquialism,
Mm.
indigenous references, criticism of the whites and the colonial the colony. So the book that we have in our hands today, although it remains a very strong book, is the shadow of what it was supposed to be.
Mm.
And this is why, before, in dialogue with Kathy, I was really thinking in my mind, this process of translation sometimes can be also threatened by the editorial intervention when, of course, the objectives, the aims of the editorial process are not the same of the author, when there is not respect. So Jones showed us that the original version was much more indigenous. And in other texts, so also in the final version, we can see that, for example, she refers to the mother of life as the creator. She refers to the carpet snake or the rainbow serpent as the most powerful ancestor creature. She refers to Aboriginal spirituality. She refers to places and objects and animals that are typical, are just belong to her land, to her culture. And she also refers to, when she talks about her childhood, for example, she describes herself as a girl split into two identities, two dimensions. The white society, because she goes to school, she speaks English, she lives in a normal life, in a Western style house. But at the same time, she grew up in a semi-traditional way. So before sleeping, she hears traditional stories. She knows all about her culture. So her parents grew her as an Aboriginal girl. So that's also an interesting. That's also visible in her style.
Yeah, kind of dual aspects of her identity, corresponding to the duality of her audience. And it looks as though Kemi has a question. I'll let her jump in if she wants to.
Yeah, thank you very much for your answers. I was just continuing on this topic in terms of style, since you said that there was still a style that's particular to her as an Aboriginal woman. I was wondering if you might have studied for example, the Italian translation of, if it has been translated into Italian at all.
It was you, right, who translated part of it, Margherita?
It was you. Okay. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. So how was that challenge? I'm very interested.
Well, I have only translated a selection of short stories. So far, as I mentioned before, the Italian translation is incomplete. And well, I look forward to be able to, perhaps one day, to be able to publish the entire book. Not easy, challenging, as Camille said. Although the challenge is, I think, more on an intercultural level, not just on an interlingual level. And I say that because if I imagine to publish an Italian edition of this book, I also imagine to address the book to a potential audience who's interested in knowing more about the Aboriginal culture, an Aboriginal culture which is apparently disappearing, at least that Aboriginal culture, Oodgeroo's Aboriginal culture. And so perhaps, and again, Kathy could add her comments, but the introduction of some footnotes, some paratexts, some glossary, perhaps, would be very much in line with Oodgeroo's educational efforts. She didn't just want to publish book for the sake of art. She wanted to publish book to share the knowledge of her people. So perhaps I would imagine to try to keep this aspect also in a potential translation in another language. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that will be, yes, particularly fit for a children's book. That would be great.
Yeah, and also we didn't talk about the illustrations.
Yeah.
I think that also that aspect, is crucial, because you could publish with the same illustration, or you could either involve a new illustrator who would interpret again the drawings and do something different, a new interpretation of the proto-text.
Into symbiotic translations.
Yeah. Yes.
You can add another type of translation to your list.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But this is why I said before that Oodgeroo's text is a ultra semiotic version, because from the oral text, she transforms an oral text into a written text with drawings, with illustrations. So we have more semiotic channels.
Yeah. Thanks. Juliette, you also had your hand up. I'm not sure if you wanted to ask a question.
Yes, but first of all, I think Kathy wanted to say something.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to, you mentioned that the most difficult part is like the intercultural translation, and that was definitely like a big barrier in our project as well, because in a certain set of poems by Ahua, like she mentions this pear tree village, and when you read it in Chinese, like as a native speaker, I automatically think about this very similar phrase that would be directly translated as like cherry blossom tree orchard. Like it's like a parallel of like this like pear tree village that she writes about. And then it becomes very like obvious immediately that like this isn't like a real place she's referring to. It's kind of like an imaginary place where everything is ideal. And a lot of her poems talk about loss, because I think like in her personal life, she lost a significant other. And so, like a lot of her poems talk about like, oh, when I go back to Pear Tree Village, or like when I'm in Pear Tree Village. But yeah, it was really difficult to translate like Pear Tree Village, and we like constantly debated whether to put a footnote about, this isn't a real place that kind of like signifies a fictional place or like an ideal location. And yeah, I was actually wondering in like the Aboriginal texts and stories whether there are like very concrete images that actually have like a whole other meaning, but if you just translate, for example, like a rainbow, people would tend to take it at face value, and whether that was a difficulty that arose.
Yes, Kathy. I think we are talking about like either realia, like untranslatable concepts, or something which is so specific, culture specific, or so individual specific also, because when you were talking before about an imaginary place, that's in the author's mind, so it's like a symbolic place, so we can only try to bring it up, to bring it to the surface with our imagination. That's where the translator's difficult comes up. So I think that the more distant are two cultures. It's always strange for me to say two cultures, because it's as if we were talking about two blocks.
Homogeneous.
Everything is in dialogue, but the more distant, the more difficult is the task of the translator, I think. Also thinking about the reader, and the reader is also a translator, because reading is translating in the end. So there will be a never-ending process of interpretation and interpretation of the interpretation. So it's difficult. If I may, I wanted to ask Kathy something, but it's I don't know, maybe it's out of place. But I was quite hit by some words that you used during your presentation. Like your emphasis of co-translation, so translation as a collective activity, and then you spoke about iterative method, the concept of productivity. And these words reminded me a bit of the culture of project management. And as I know that you work at Google, I wonder if some of the culture of the project management culture, which is a way to a method to work, has have any impact on your translation project, your translation work.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I guess like in my mind, I really love like doing things that are outside of tech and my main job. And like in my brain, it's kind of like a break from the the day job that I have. So they seem quite different, but maybe like subconsciously, how I approach this problem could be a bit similar to how I approach things in a work context. I think I tend to be a bit more persistent with like setting up meeting times and like doing things on a schedule. And there's also like a layer of introducing some like features in the Google Docs to my partner because she's not as familiar with like all the different modes and things you can do that help this editing process easier.
What kinds of things?
Like I think the suggestions mode, for example, like I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with it, but it kind of automatically like shows all your edits as like strikeouts or like your new edits in different color. And before she was kind of doing that manually, like changing the text color to show me what things she changed. So I think there was sort of like a technology exchange going on there. But yeah, I'd be really curious to see if like you could approach working on these types of translation or humanities projects through some framework that's maybe more typical in other fields, and whether that could be, productive to the field to like import those methods.
And so if I may intervene, my question was for Kathy, but I like how the discussion went into like seeing the translator as an intercultural product themselves, like bringing different cultural areas together and seeing how this may affect your vision of things. That was great. I wanted to ask Kathy about, you mentioned Buddhist undertones and images that you had trouble translating into English, or maybe gave up on sometimes, and you picked poems that were more universal, had more universal themes. So that I thought that was very interesting. Do you have any more details about that?
Yeah. So I guess Ahua's poems, like a lot of them tend to talk about nature. And then there is like, we noticed kind of a shift in themes. At some point in Xiangpuji, like the published volume that we worked with, there was like a couple consecutive poems that mentioned more like, that quoted like sutras or mentioned like temples and mentioned like the, like chants and like prayer beads and things like those. And so we did actually translate those works, but it felt harder to explain the subtleties of like why is this sutra mentioned, right? And like what is like the theme of the sutra and everything without adding a ton of like commentary, basically. So a lot of the times, like we've been submitting to journals, like we submit maybe one to three poems, and usually if we submit multiple, they want something that's like coherent within the theme. And so, to further explain like what the theme is on top of explaining the poems themselves, just seemed like oftentimes it was a bit too difficult to talk about like the Buddhism and the concepts underlying that. So yeah, like as I mentioned, we ended up a lot of times choosing some more common themes, like poems that all had to do with autumn, or like poems that all kind of had like elements of water in them, or like changing of seasons. And yeah, I'm not exactly sure right now, like what would be a solution towards bridging this like cultural gap. Because like Buddhism, I think, is a lot less familiar in Western cultures, like compared to like Christianity and even like Islam. And so yeah, I'm not quite sure as translators, like how we could make that information easier to share.
Perhaps
It
it would
would
be a more
seem-
perhaps it would
Yeah.
be a more straightforward process in a longer publication, because as you say, if you're just required to provide 2 or 3 poems, and you're already explaining the theme, it's like a lot to go on and explain the complexities of the references within the poems. Whereas yeah, if you have a longer collection, maybe you could write a preface or something like that, and you'd have more space to address those themes. But have you had any success in publishing your poems, your translations?
Yeah, I think we have 3 journals now that we all heard back like very recently within the month. So I think one of them might be out, and the other 2 are still in the works.
Okay.
But yeah,
Once they're published, if you could send us the links, then we'll send them out to the network.
yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Sorry, Juliette, I interrupted you.
Oh, it's fine. I was also thinking, yeah, you have, as a translator or maybe the editor, is trying to make choices that are adapted to a certain readership, and maybe they're trying to think what Western readers will want to read about or already be familiar with, or how much exoticism they're ready for. And I think it's always interesting to see how those decisions are made, and even when they're unconscious sometimes. But you probably, when you submit 2 or 3 poems, probably pick something that exemplify the reader's work, maybe the most representative poems, I guess. I don't know if you have any of those processes in mind.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about as well. I think in the poems that we've submitted recently, we went with things that don't necessarily like have Chinese elements in them, like a lot of nature related poems. Yeah, I think those were definitely like easier, that we felt like would be easier for an audience to understand. And yeah, even though, so I joined this project a little over a year ago, and then before I joined, my partner Xuelan, she was already working through the translations herself. So she's done a few more out of like the over 100 poems, but we just haven't like gone through them together yet. And I think back then, like, you know, we were going through a lot of different poems that had a lot of more like culturally specific allusions. And yeah, so throughout the process of working over this year, I think by the time that we got close to like submitting to journals, we've really converged on the end of like universal themes. But I would like to see us try to submit more, you know, more like different sorts of imagery and different themes now that we've like tested out the waters with what publishers are looking for and what types of questions they usually have about our work, and use that as feedback for how we can try to convey something that's a bit more difficult or like culturally dissimilar. Yeah.
Seems really strategic as a move, even if perhaps it wasn't. But it seems like it's kind of a way of getting the work published, getting it out there, and
Right.
making sure that the person the author has a name for herself, sort of, in English, and being able to show that her work has already been published before you move on to the potentially more obscure stuff that might be more difficult.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, exactly. Because we've had like we were like completely uncertain about like how good our translations were perceived as, or like what people were looking for. And so really like the recent submissions were more about testing out the waters. Yeah.
Very clever.
About showcasing how talented the author is, and not necessarily her Chinese element, but like what is universal in what she writes as well.
Right, yeah. And especially because so many of her poems, they talked about like loss and just like navigating through like your emotions. And I think like all of those, that was part of why like we wanted to try publishing her in a different country. A lot of those seemed very universal and relatable, and it just seemed like it wasn't accessible to a different audience. But like in terms of the language barrier, but we thought that once that could be bridged, like a lot of people would be able to appreciate her poems as is, without any sort of like cultural hindrance.
Margherita, have any of your translations of the short stories been published online? Anywhere have you published them within the context of academic publications? Are they being included in them?
Yes, I published some short stories taken from Stradbroke Dreamtime back in 2012 in an American journal. Perhaps maybe I will share later on the PDF document. And also in 2017, I published a chapter, an essay dedicated to this particular work, with a couple of translations of texts included in the essay. So far, and I think I cross my fingers. I have an article, a scientific article, under review at the moment. So
great, yeah. Well, once both of you have you already have links that you can share with us, or documents that you can share with us, we'll pass them on to the network. It'll be great to get that work out there. I've just noticed that it's 6:36. So I guess it's 2:36 where you are, Kathy. We're very late. I hope that you don't have to work early tomorrow morning.
No, tomorrow is a bit more relaxed, but no worries.
Okay, I also noticed that it's Juliette who entitled this session "Negotiating Intercultural Gaps," and it seems as though it was a fitting title. Well done, Juliette, who anticipated correctly the kinds of discussions that we would have. It was very interesting to see the parallels between, very, very different culturally and stylistically, two very different texts and authors, but there are lots of parallels there. In terms of the decisions that one has to make when providing text for a kind of heterogeneous audience. So thank you very much to both of you for your very stimulating talks and then also very stimulating discussion. I had lots more questions written down that I wanted to ask you, but maybe another day. Well, our next session is actually quite soon. It's in February, on the 8th of February, and the title also given by Juliette to this session is Questioning Western Translator and Academic Positionality. And Juliette will be chairing the session. We'll be hearing from Simona Dataco, definitely not how you pronounce the last name, and Kate Roy with two colleagues, Emmeline Atkin and Layla Ahmed. And so they'll be talking about their research project. So hopefully you'll be able to join us then in 2 weeks' time, I guess. And until then, wish you all a very pleasant evening/night or a day, depending on where you are. But thank you very much for attending. We hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thank you very much for hosting, and it was really great to join the session.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thanks, Margherita.
Thank you all. Thanks.
We're still recording.
Thank
you very much.
Bye.